Chapter 1. The Morning I Had Nothing Left. Morning came quietly. No alarm, no urgency, no reason to rush. Light slipped through the thin curtains and settled on the wall across from the bed. It revealed peeling paint, a crooked frame with no picture inside, and the faint outline of a stain that looked like it had been there longer than I had. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of traffic waking up somewhere far away. Cars moved. People went to work. Life continued with its usual confidence. Mine did not. The room smelled faintly of old detergent and cold air. It was small enough that I could see almost everything without turning my head. A narrow table, a single chair, a cheap suitcase leaning against the wall, zipped shut. Nothing on the table except a folded piece of paper. I knew what was written on it. An address. One I hadn't visited in years. I didn't reach for it yet. For a moment, I tried to remember what day it was. That used to matter. Deadlines, meetings, schedules. Now it felt irrelevant. Every day had begun to look the same once there was nothing left to prepare for. I finally sat up, letting my feet touch the cold floor. The sensation barely registered. My body moved out of habit, not intention. There was no panic, no racing heart, no sudden fear, just a dull, heavy stillness. I had expected this moment to feel dramatic. I had imagined tears, anger, maybe even a sense of urgency that would force me to act. But none of that came. Instead, there was emptiness. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that waits. I stood and walked to the small mirror above the sink. The reflection looking back at me felt unfamiliar. Not because I looked different, but because I didn't feel present behind my own eyes. My face was calm, too calm. I turned on the tap and watched the water run. Clear, cold, uninterested in my situation. I splashed my face once and turned it off. The silence returned immediately. No notifications, no messages, no reminders of what I was supposed to be doing. There was nothing to avoid anymore. I thought about the days that had led here, but my mind refused to trace them now. Whatever explanations I once had no longer mattered. What mattered was this moment. I had no job to go to, no money waiting in an account, no plan beyond the next few hours. The realization didn't land like a shock. It landed like a fact. I sat back down on the edge of the bed and finally picked up the folded paper. The edges were worn, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. I opened it slowly, even though I already knew every word. Just an address. Nothing else. No message, no apology, no promise. I held it between my fingers and felt something settle in my chest. Not sadness, not fear, but clarity. This wasn't failure. Failure implies effort, a fall from somewhere higher. This was zero. The absence of forward motion, the absence of direction, the absence of anything to lose. That thought should have scared me. It didn't. It numbed me. I looked around the room again, as if seeing it for the first time. Everything I owned fit inside that suitcase. Clothes chosen for practicality, not preference. Shoes worn thin. No objects with history. No reminders of who I used to be. I had stripped my life down to the bare minimum without realizing it. And now, standing in the quiet of a cheap rented room, I understood that there was nothing left to strip away. The stillness grew heavier as the minutes passed. I didn't check the time. I didn't need to. Time felt irrelevant when there was nowhere to be. Outside, someone laughed. A door slammed. The world continued its rhythm without me. I felt detached from it, like I was watching life through glass. I sat there longer than I meant to. The thought of moving felt unnecessary. There was no next step waiting for me, no obvious direction, just that address. I folded the paper again and slipped it into my pocket, not because I was ready to go, but because holding it made things feel too real. I needed a few more minutes of nothing. I lay back down on the bed, staring up at the ceiling once more. The stain looked like a map now, an outline of places I had never been. I wondered briefly how many other people had lain here, in this same room with their own versions of nothing. The thought didn't comfort me, but it reminded me that this wasn't unique. People reached zero quietly every day, not with explosions or scandals, but with exhaustion, with small losses that added up, with decisions delayed too long. I closed my eyes and listened to my breathing. Slow, even, alive. That surprised me. Despite everything, I was still here. I wasn't broken. I wasn't defeated. I wasn't even devastated. I was empty. And emptiness, I realized, was different from hopelessness. Hopelessness demands an ending. Emptiness leaves space. The thought drifted through my mind without resistance. I didn't cling to it. I didn't reject it. I simply noticed it. After a while, I stood again and zipped open the suitcase. I checked its contents without rearranging anything, as if confirming it was still real. It was. I pulled on a jacket and slipped my hands into the pockets. Nothing there. No keys that mattered. No wallet heavy with cards I no longer used. I paused at the door. For the first time that morning, something stirred inside me. Not motivation, not courage, awareness. There was nowhere left to wait, no position to protect, no image to maintain, no illusion to uphold. Just a door and an address. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, pulling it shut behind me. The sound echoed briefly, then faded. Standing there, I understood something quietly, without drama. Starting over wasn't something I had planned. It was something that had arrived when everything else was gone. This wasn't failure. This was zero. And zero, whether I was ready or not, was a beginning. Chapter 2. How I Lost Everything Slowly. Looking back, the strange thing is how quiet it all was. There was no single moment I could point to and say, that's when everything fell apart. No dramatic argument, no sudden betrayal, no phone call that changed my life overnight. If someone had asked me back then how I was doing, I would have said I was fine, and I would have believed it. The job went first, though it didn't feel like losing it at the time. I was still showing up every day, still sitting at the same desk, still answering emails. On the surface, nothing had changed. Inside, something had already started to fade. I stopped caring in small ways. I delayed tasks that once mattered to me. I avoided conversations that required energy I no longer had. I told myself I was tired, that everyone goes through phases like this. When feedback came, I nodded and promised to do better. When opportunities appeared, I hesitated just long enough for them to move on to someone else. No one pushed me out. I slowly stepped back. Each day, I gave a little less of myself and told myself it was temporary, that I would re-engage when things felt clearer, when I felt more like myself again. That moment never came. Eventually, the silence around me grew louder. Meetings stopped including my name. Decisions were made without my input. I noticed, but I didn't protest. It was easier not to. When the job ended, it felt almost logical. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't angry. I told myself it made sense, that it was just business, that I would find something else. I said all the right things. Inside, something cracked quietly. Relationships followed a similar pattern. I didn't fight with anyone. I didn't cut people off. I just became less available. I answered messages later. I canceled plans more often. I listened less carefully when others spoke. I told myself I needed space. What I really needed was honesty with myself. People noticed the distance, even if they couldn't name it. They asked if I was okay. I smiled and said yes. They accepted the answer because it was easier for both of us. Over time, invitations stopped coming as often. Conversations stayed surface level. Connections loosened. No one left angrily. They simply adjusted to my absence. I adjusted too. I learned how to exist without leaning on anyone, how to appear steady while feeling hollow, how to keep conversations short so no one noticed how little I had to say. The lonelier I became, the more I convinced myself I preferred it that way. It felt safer to believe I didn't need much. The last thing to go was my belief in myself. That loss was the hardest to see because it happened quietly beneath layers of rationalization. I stopped trusting my instincts. I questioned my reactions. I second-guessed every idea before it had a chance to form fully. When I thought about the future, my thoughts felt vague and heavy. I couldn't picture anything clearly, so I stopped trying. I told myself I was being realistic. I told myself I was lowering expectations to avoid disappointment. What I was really doing was shrinking. I avoided risks because they required belief. I avoided decisions because they required commitment. I avoided reflection because it asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. Each avoidance felt small. Together, they changed everything. There was never a moment where I admitted I was struggling, not out loud, not even to myself. I kept functioning. I kept moving through the days. I paid bills. I showed up where I had to. I did what was necessary. From the outside, my life looked quiet but manageable. Inside, I was slowly disconnecting from it. The most painful part was how convincing the illusion became. I genuinely believed I was okay. I believed that nothing was seriously wrong because nothing was visibly broken. I believed that stability meant health, that silence meant peace. It took me a long time to understand the difference. The losses piled up without announcement. Confidence faded, motivation thinned, purpose slipped into the background until it was barely noticeable. I didn't wake up one day and realize I had lost everything. I arrived at that realization gradually, in hindsight. When I think about it now, one sentence explains it better than anything else. I didn't lose everything at once. I let it slip while pretending I was fine. That pretending became a habit. I learned how to deflect concern, how to minimize my own feelings, how to explain away dissatisfaction as normal adulthood. Everyone's tired. Everyone's busy. Everyone feels disconnected sometimes. Those thoughts kept me from asking deeper questions. They kept me from noticing how much I was giving up without resistance. The tragedy wasn't that things fell apart. It was that I watched them loosen and did nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because caring felt exhausting. Looking back, I can see the moments where I might have paused, where I might have spoken honestly, where I might have asked for help or chosen differently. At the time, those moments didn't feel significant. They were just small crossroads I walked past quietly. That's how everything was lost. Not through chaos, not through disaster, but through delay. By the time I noticed how empty things had become, The distance was already there, between me and my work, me and others, me and myself. And still, I told myself I was fine, because admitting otherwise felt heavier than staying silent. It wasn't until I reached zero, until there was nothing left to maintain, that I could finally see the pattern clearly. The losses had been slow, real, painful, and they had been happening in plain sight the entire time. Chapter 3. The Shame of Beginning Again. The first place I went to ask for work was a small grocery store 2 blocks from the room I was staying in. It wasn't part of any plan. I didn't wake up that morning feeling determined or hopeful. I went because I needed something to do, somewhere to stand that wasn't my own thoughts. The automatic doors slid open, and for a moment, I almost turned around. The smell of cleaning supplies and bread hit me at the same time. A normal place. Ordinary. The kind of place people passed through without thinking. I stood there longer than necessary, my hands shoved into my pockets, feeling exposed in a way I hadn't expected. I hadn't imagined starting over would feel like this. Not hard. Humiliating. I approached the counter slowly and asked if they were hiring. My voice sounded steady, but my chest felt tight. The words tasted unfamiliar, like I was borrowing someone else's life. The manager looked at me briefly, then handed me a form. No recognition, no curiosity, no concern. Just a form. I should have felt relieved. Instead, shame burned quietly under my skin. I filled it out at a small table near the entrance. As I wrote, I became acutely aware of my age, of the years listed on the page, of how long it had been since I last filled out something like this. I imagined what they might see when they looked at it. Someone who should be further along. Someone who had fallen behind. Someone who didn't quite belong here. The thought made my stomach twist. This wasn't fear. Fear would have told me I might fail. Shame told me I already had. I left the store quickly after turning in the form, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Outside, the air felt colder than it had earlier. I walked with my head down, replaying the moment again and again. I told myself it didn't matter, that this was temporary, that everyone has to start somewhere. The words felt hollow. Later that week, I stayed on a friend's couch. Just for a while, I said, just until I figured things out. They were kind, too kind. They offered food, space, reassurance. They told me not to worry, that things would turn around. I smiled and thanked them, careful not to take up too much room. At night, lying there in the dark, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of someone else's life happening around me. Doors closing, dishes clinking, quiet conversations I wasn't part of. I felt small, not because I needed help, but because I needed it at this point in my life. I had always imagined needing support would come early, when mistakes were expected. Not now, when people assumed you had things figured out. I began to measure myself against everyone else without needing to. Friends with careers that had momentum, people younger than me who seemed confident, established, moving forward. Even strangers whose routines looked solid from the outside. Every comparison landed the same way. Behind. I felt like I had missed a train everyone else had boarded years ago, and now I was standing on the platform, watching it disappear into the distance, pretending I hadn't wanted to get on. The question followed me everywhere. Is it too late to start again? I didn't ask it out loud. I carried it silently, letting it color every interaction. When someone asked what I was doing now, I gave vague answers. I avoided specifics. I learned how to deflect without lying. I hated that version of myself, the one who spoke carefully, who avoided honesty out of embarrassment. The shame was constant, but quiet. It didn't scream, it didn't demand attention. It sat in my chest and weighed everything down. I noticed how it affected my posture, my voice, my choices. I moved cautiously, as if trying not to be seen. I accepted less than I wanted because wanting more felt inappropriate. Who was I to want anything now? The fear was there too, but it lived underneath the shame. Fear whispered about failure, about rejection, about the possibility that I would try and confirm my worst beliefs. Shame told me I shouldn't try at all, because trying implied hope, and hope felt dangerous at this stage. Some nights I replayed old versions of myself, the person I thought I would become, the paths I believed I would take. I compared those images to where I was now and felt something tighten in my throat. I didn't cry often. Crying felt indulgent. Instead, I lay still and let the weight press down, convincing myself that this was simply the consequence of my choices. And maybe it was, but that didn't make it easier. I began to realize that beginning again wasn't just about practical steps. It was about facing the judgment I placed on myself, the belief that starting over later meant starting from a place of failure. No one else had said that to me. I had decided it myself. The shame was isolating. It made me withdraw even from those who wanted to help. It made me believe that my value had decreased with time, that my chances had narrowed. I felt exposed in every small action, every application, every conversation, every decision that reminded me of how far back I felt. Still, beneath the shame, something else lingered. A quiet awareness. Despite everything, I was still moving. Slowly, uncomfortably, imperfectly, I was showing up. That didn't erase the shame. It didn't quiet the question, is it too late to start again? But it did something important. It kept me from stopping completely. I didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a shift, not away from shame, but through it. Because before anything could change, I had to face the truth honestly. Not that I was behind, but that I was still here, and that mattered more than I was willing to admit. Chapter 4. The first small step that meant nothing. The first small step didn't look like hope. It looked like routine. I woke up before the alarm went off, not because I had somewhere important to be, but because my body had learned the habit of waking early. For a few seconds, I lay still, listening to the quiet of the room, waiting for the familiar heaviness to settle in. It did. But something else was there too. A thought. Simple, unimpressive. Get up anyway. There was no motivation behind it, no surge of purpose, just a decision so small it barely felt like one. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and swung my feet onto the floor. The room looked the same as it always did. The suitcase, the chair, the folded jacket. Nothing had changed. I made the bed slowly, not because it mattered, but because it gave my hands something to do. The sheets were thin and uneven. When I finished, the bed didn't look better, just different. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. This was not progress, but it was movement. Later that morning, I walked down the street without a destination. I passed the grocery store again, the one where I had asked for work days earlier. I expected to feel the same sting of embarrassment. I didn't. It wasn't gone, but it was quieter. A delivery truck was parked at the curb. The driver struggled to lift a heavy box from the back. He paused, adjusting his grip, frustration written clearly across his face. I hesitated. Helping would draw attention. It would mean interaction. It would mean being seen. Before I could think myself out of it, I stepped forward and grabbed the other end of the box. He looked up, surprised. "Thanks," he said. We carried it together a few steps and set it down. No conversation followed, no names exchanged. He nodded once and went back to work. I walked away, my heart beating slightly faster than before. No one applauded, no one noticed, nothing changed. And yet, something inside me felt awake. The feeling startled me. It wasn't joy, it wasn't pride, it was presence. I realized how long it had been since I'd acted without analyzing the outcome, since I'd done something simply because it was there to be done. That afternoon, my phone rang. The grocery store. They needed help unloading shipments, temporary, a few days, early mornings. I accepted before I could talk myself out of it. The work was physical, simple, repetitive. My muscles ached by midday, sweat soaked through my shirt. My muscles complained in places I had forgotten existed. No one asked about my past. No one cared where I had been before. They showed me what to lift, where to stack it, when to take breaks. That was it. At the end of the shift, my body was exhausted in a way that felt honest. I sat on the curb outside, drinking water, my palms dirty, my legs sore. I felt alive. Not accomplished, not successful, alive. It surprised me how little it took. Not a breakthrough, not a vision, just effort. I returned the next day, and the day after that. The work didn't get easier, but it got familiar. I learned the rhythm, the timing, the quiet satisfaction of finishing a task and moving on to the next. No one praised me, no one asked about my goals, no one told me this was a turning point. That made it easier. There was no pressure to turn this into something meaningful. It just existed. In the mornings, I woke up with a reason to get out of bed. Not a big reason, not a dream, a shift. I noticed changes in small, unexpected ways. My thoughts didn't spiral as much. My body felt anchored. The days had shape again, beginning, middle, end. One evening, as I walked back to the room I was staying in, I realized something quietly. I wasn't counting the hours anymore. That mattered. The numbness hadn't vanished, but it had loosened its grip. I could feel again, fatigue, irritation, brief moments of satisfaction. Those sensations reminded me I was here. The shame didn't disappear either. It lingered in the background, whispering that this wasn't enough, that this didn't count. I let it whisper. I kept going. I woke up early even on days I didn't have work. I made coffee. I sat by the window. I watched the city move. I stopped waiting for the feeling to change before acting. I acted and let the feeling follow. One morning, as I tied my shoes, the sentence surfaced clearly in my mind. It wasn't progress, but it was movement. The words felt solid, true. I didn't attach expectations to them. I didn't turn them into a promise. I let them be what they were. Movement pulled me out of paralysis in a way that thinking never had. It reminded me that I didn't need a perfect plan to begin. I needed momentum. Small, imperfect, unremarkable momentum. I understood then why the first step had to be small. Anything bigger would have triggered the old patterns: fear, hesitation, overthinking. This step slipped under the radar, and because it meant nothing to anyone else, it meant everything to me. I wasn't fixed, I wasn't confident, I wasn't sure where this would lead, but I was no longer frozen. That was enough. The transformation wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It happened quietly, in the repetition of showing up, in the humility of doing what was in front of me, in the decision to move instead of wait. For the first time since reaching 0, I felt the ground shift slightly beneath my feet. Not forward, but out of stillness. And that changed everything. Chapter 5. Falling Again After Starting Over. For a while, the movement felt like enough. The days filled themselves with small routines. Work in the mornings, walking home in the afternoons, simple meals, early nights. I stopped measuring time by what I was missing and started measuring it by what I completed. That shift gave me something close to hope. And hope, I learned quickly, can be fragile. The first rejection came quietly, an email that began with polite gratitude and ended with familiar disappointment. I read it once, then again, waiting for something inside me to react. It didn't hurt the way I expected, not at first. I told myself it was part of the process, that rejection was normal, that this didn't erase the progress I had made. I repeated those thoughts carefully, like placing fragile objects back on a shelf. The second rejection arrived 2 days later, shorter, less personal. The third came the following week. Each one chipped away at something I had begun to rebuild. Not my confidence, I hadn't let that grow yet, but my patience. I noticed how quickly exhaustion returned. Not physical exhaustion, that I could manage. This was heavier. A tiredness that settled behind my eyes and made even simple tasks feel unnecessary. I woke up some mornings and lay still, staring at the ceiling, wondering why I was pushing so hard for outcomes that didn't seem to care. The grocery store job ended without ceremony. They thanked me, they shook my hand, they didn't offer anything more. Temporary meant temporary. I walked home that afternoon feeling the weight of the bag on my shoulder, the familiar tightness in my chest creeping back. The old thoughts waited for me. See? This doesn't last. This is as far as you go. I tried to push them aside, but they felt louder now because I had tasted movement. I had felt what it was like to be active again, to believe, even cautiously, that change was possible. Losing that momentum hurt more than losing nothing at all. That night, I sat alone on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. My body felt heavy, my thoughts slow. I had done everything I was supposed to do. I showed up, I tried, I moved, and still I was back here. The disappointment wasn't dramatic. It didn't explode. It sunk. I began questioning the small steps I had taken, wondering if they had meant anything, wondering if I had mistaken motion for progress. The sentence surfaced again, uninvited. Maybe nothing will ever change. It frightened me how easily the thought fit. The next few days blurred together. I went through the motions, but without the quiet energy that had carried me before. I applied for jobs with less intention. I waited longer before checking responses. I caught myself thinking about stopping, not giving up completely, just pausing, just waiting again. That idea felt familiar, comfortable, dangerous. Starting over had given me the illusion that the hard part was behind me, that once I began, things would naturally improve. They didn't. They pushed back. I realized how unprepared I was for that resistance. I had braced myself for starting with nothing. I hadn't prepared for starting again and still feeling stuck. The second fall felt worse than the first. The first time I had nothing to compare it to. This time I knew what it felt like to move, to have structure, to feel briefly useful. Losing that stung more than losing nothing at all. I avoided people, not because they had done anything wrong, but because I didn't want to answer questions. I didn't want to explain why I was still here, still uncertain, still rebuilding. I didn't want to admit to myself or anyone else that starting over hurt just as much as failing the first time. Some nights I lay awake replaying the days when everything had seemed to shift. I wondered if I had imagined it, if I had mistaken distraction for growth. I questioned my judgment. Again. That was the most familiar pain of all. The shame crept back in quietly, not as sharp as before, but persistent. It told me that this was proof, that this cycle would repeat, that effort didn't guarantee anything. I listened longer than I should have. The temptation to quit wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It showed up as fatigue, as indifference, as the thought that stopping would at least bring relief. I understood then why so many people return to waiting. Waiting is predictable. Waiting doesn't disappoint. Trying does. One evening, as I walked past the same streets I had walked weeks earlier with cautious optimism, I felt the weight of disappointment settle fully. I stopped and leaned against a building, breathing slowly, feeling the familiar urge to retreat. This was the moment I hadn't prepared for. Not the beginning, but the setback. The moment when effort didn't pay off and nothing seemed to shift. I closed my eyes and acknowledged the truth without softening it. Starting over was painful. It wasn't inspiring. It wasn't rewarding. It wasn't linear. It hurt in a way that felt personal. The realization didn't comfort me, but it grounded me. Because beneath the exhaustion, beneath the doubt, something else remained. I hadn't stopped moving. Even now, even here, I was still choosing action over retreat. That mattered, even if it didn't feel like enough. I stood there longer than necessary, then pushed myself upright and continued walking. Not because I felt hopeful, but because stopping felt worse. That night, I accepted something I had been resisting. Starting over wasn't a moment. It was a series of decisions made in the presence of disappointment. And falling again didn't mean I was back at zero. It meant I was still in the process. That understanding didn't erase the pain, but it kept me from quitting. And for now, that was enough to keep going.
Chapter 6. The truth about starting with nothing. The realization didn't arrive suddenly. There was no moment of clarity, no sharp turn in thought that split my life into before and after. It came slowly, like light creeping into a room you've been sitting in for so long that darkness felt normal. I noticed it one afternoon while sitting alone in a public park. I had nowhere else to be, no schedule to follow, no expectations pressing down on me. I sat on a bench and watched people pass by. Parents pushing strollers, couples talking quietly, someone jogging with headphones in. Everyone seemed to be moving toward something. For the first time in a long while, I didn't envy them. I felt strangely detached, as if I were standing outside the usual hierarchy of progress and comparison. I wasn't behind them. I wasn't ahead. I was simply not competing. That was when the thought surfaced, calm and steady. I have nothing left to lose. The idea should have terrified me. In the past, it would have. Losing status, comfort, direction, those were my greatest fears. But sitting there, with nothing waiting for me, and no one expecting anything from me, the thought felt different. It felt light. I began to see how much of my life had been shaped by what I was trying not to lose. Approval, stability, a version of myself that looked acceptable from the outside. I had guarded those things carefully, even when they no longer fit, even when protecting them meant shrinking. Now they were gone, and I felt freer than I had in years. There was no image left to protect, no title to live up to, no role to perform, no expectations to maintain. I didn't have to explain why I was where I was. I didn't have to pretend I was doing better than I was. Nothing demanded performance from me anymore. That realization unsettled me at first. I didn't know what to do with that kind of freedom. It felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. But the more I sat with it, the more it made sense. Starting with nothing stripped away the noise. There was no pressure to build something impressive, no urgency to prove my worth, no need to justify choices that didn't make sense to anyone else. I could build slowly, honestly. I thought about the paths I had avoided before, not because they were wrong, but because they didn't align with the image I thought I needed to maintain. The conversations I hadn't had, the risks I hadn't taken. All of that restraint had been rooted in fear of losing what little security I had. Now, that fear had no leverage. I realized how often I had compromised truth for comfort, how often I had said yes to things that drained me simply because saying no felt dangerous. With nothing left, saying no felt easier. So did saying yes to things that mattered. That evening, I walked home with a different awareness. The streets looked the same, the buildings hadn't changed, but my relationship to them had. I wasn't moving through the city trying to reclaim an old life. I was moving through it open to building a new one. The difference was subtle but profound. I didn't suddenly become confident. I didn't feel certain about the future. Doubt still existed, fear still lingered, but they no longer controlled the narrative. I understood then that nothing had been my foundation all along. I just hadn't recognized it. Starting with nothing meant I could finally build honestly. That sentence settled into me with unexpected weight. Honestly meant without pretending, without forcing timelines, without chasing versions of success that didn't resonate. It meant allowing myself to be a beginner again, without apology. I thought about how often people romanticize hitting rock bottom, how they frame it as dramatic, destructive, something to avoid at all costs. But rock bottom isn't always violent. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just the absence of distractions. And in that absence, you hear the truth clearly for the first time. I began to see my earlier setbacks differently, not as proof of failure, but as necessary friction, resistance that revealed what mattered and what didn't. The rejection still hurt, the uncertainty still weighed on me, but beneath it all, there was a new steadiness. I wasn't clinging anymore. That changed how I approached the next steps. I applied for opportunities that aligned with my actual skills, not the ones I thought I should want. I spoke honestly when asked what I was doing, without minimizing or exaggerating. I allowed myself to start where I was, not where I believed I should be. There was humility in that, and relief. I noticed how much energy I had wasted before trying to control perception, trying to manage how others saw my progress, my worth, my direction. Now there was nothing to manage. And in that emptiness, I found space. Space to think clearly, space to listen, space to choose. Nothing wasn't a void. It was a clean slate. I didn't rush to fill it. For the first time, I trusted that I didn't need to. I understood that rebuilding didn't require grand gestures. It required alignment between what I did and what I valued. That alignment had been impossible when I was trying to protect an image that no longer fit. Starting with nothing had removed that burden. I walked slower after that realization. I noticed things more. I listened more carefully to myself and to others. The world didn't suddenly open its doors, but I opened myself. And that was the real shift. I didn't feel powerful. I felt grounded. And for the first time since everything had fallen away, that felt enough.
Chapter 7. Building a Life No One Applauds. The life I began to build didn't look like success. It was small. It moved slowly, at a pace that would have bored the version of me who once chased milestones and approval. There were no announcements, no celebrations, no moments that demanded recognition. Most days, nothing remarkable happened. And yet, for the first time in a long while, I felt steady. My mornings became quiet rituals. I woke up early, not out of urgency, but habit. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the street wake up. I didn't scroll through my phone looking for validation or distraction. I let the silence exist. I took work where I could find it, nothing glamorous, nothing that impressed anyone. Tasks that required attention, patience, and consistency. Work that ended when the day ended. No one asked me about my long-term plan. No one praised my progress. At first, that absence felt uncomfortable. I had grown used to measuring my worth by reactions, by responses, recognition, and reassurance. Without those signals, I felt exposed, unsure of how to evaluate myself. But slowly, something shifted. I stopped waiting for someone to notice. I noticed myself. I paid attention to how I showed up, even when no one was watching, how I completed tasks with care, not because they would lead somewhere, but because they mattered in the moment, how I treated people without expecting anything in return. There was dignity in that. The days stacked quietly, not with achievements, but with consistency. I learned the weight of routine, not the suffocating kind that numbs you, but the grounding kind that holds you in place. I cooked simple meals and ate them slowly. I walked the same routes and began to recognize faces. Familiarity replaced novelty, and in that familiarity, I felt safe. There was no rush to transform my life into something impressive, no urgency to prove that starting over had been worth it. That pressure had fallen away when I stopped performing for an audience that no longer existed. The peace surprised me. It didn't arrive dramatically. It didn't erase doubt or uncertainty. It lived alongside them, steady and quiet. I realized that much of my earlier dissatisfaction had come from chasing a version of life that required constant approval. Applause, even when subtle, had shaped my decisions. Without it, I was free to build something that fit me, not something admired, something sustainable. I began to trust my own judgment again, not because it was flawless, but because it was honest. I chose what felt right, not what looked right. That trust was fragile at first. I tested it in small ways, declining invitations that drained me, accepting opportunities that aligned with my values, even if they offered no status. Each decision strengthened it. Self-respect returned quietly, without ceremony. It showed up in how I spoke about myself, how I held my posture, how I responded to setbacks. I didn't need to justify where I was anymore. That was new. There were moments of loneliness, moments where I wondered if I was missing out on something bigger, something brighter. I saw others chasing visible success, sharing milestones, celebrating loudly. I didn't resent them. I just didn't want that anymore. The absence of applause became a kind of protection. It allowed me to grow without comparison, to move at a pace dictated by reality, not expectation. I found satisfaction in things that once felt insignificant, a job done well, a conversation that felt genuine, a night of restful sleep. These weren't rewards, they were foundations. I understood then that healing didn't mean becoming unrecognizable, it meant becoming consistent, reliable to myself. I didn't need to announce my growth, I could live it. The quiet empowerment came from knowing that my life no longer depended on external affirmation, that my worth wasn't tied to speed or visibility. I was building something solid, even if no one clapped. And that was enough. One evening, as I walked home after a long day, I felt a familiar sense of fatigue, but it was clean, honest, earned. I wasn't running from anything. I wasn't chasing anything either. I was present. That presence became my measure of success. I learned that a life no one applauds can still be deeply meaningful, that peace doesn't require recognition, that self-respect grows best when it's not on display. The world didn't change around me. I did. And that change didn't ask for attention. It simply held.
Chapter 8. I started over with nothing, and that was enough. There was no moment when everything finally came together. No sudden success. No dramatic breakthrough. No scene that would look impressive if someone else told the story. Life didn't reward me with applause for surviving it, and somehow that felt right. I began to notice the change only when I stopped looking for it, when I stopped measuring my days against what they were supposed to become and started paying attention to what they already were. I wasn't rich. I wasn't celebrated. I wasn't ahead of anyone, but I was present. That realization arrived quietly, one ordinary evening as I sat alone at a small table, eating a simple meal I had made myself. The window was open, the air moved gently through the room. There was nothing remarkable about the moment, except that I was there for it. I wasn't rushing through it. I wasn't distracted by regret. I wasn't planning an escape. I was living inside my own life again. That hadn't always been the case. For years, I had existed just ahead of myself, waiting for the next phase, the next opportunity, the next version of me that would finally feel ready. I postponed living in favor of preparing. I see now how much that cost me. Not money, not status, but time spent disconnected from myself. Starting over with nothing stripped that away. When everything familiar disappeared, so did the excuses. I could no longer tell myself I was waiting for the right moment. There was nothing left to wait for. Only choices. Small ones, unimpressive ones, but honest ones. I chose to stay when I would have run before. I chose to try without certainty. I chose to accept what was instead of chasing what looked better. Those choices didn't transform my life overnight. They anchored it. I didn't become fearless. Doubt still visited. So did uncertainty. Some days felt heavier than others. Some mornings carried echoes of the past. But the difference was simple and profound. I no longer avoided myself. I didn't fill silence with distractions. I didn't drown discomfort in ambition or denial. I allowed myself to feel where I was without judgment. That was enough. I thought often about the version of me who reached zero and believed that nothing meant failure. That version couldn't see what I see now. Nothing wasn't the end. It was the removal of everything false. Without expectations pressing down on me, I learned what mattered. Without an image to maintain, I found honesty. Without a future I was chasing, I discovered the present. I didn't rebuild my life into something extraordinary. I rebuilt it into something real. The work I did didn't define me. The pace I moved at didn't shame me. The simplicity of my days didn't diminish me. They grounded me. I learned to value steadiness over excitement, alignment over appearance, presence over progress. That shift changed how I moved through the world. I listened more. I reacted less. I trusted myself again, not because I had all the answers, but because I stopped ignoring my own voice. That trust became the quiet center of everything. Sometimes I wondered if I should want more, if I was settling, if contentment was just another form of retreat. But the thought never stayed long, because I knew the difference now. I wasn't hiding. I was choosing. Choosing a life that fit instead of one that impressed. Choosing honesty over performance. Choosing peace over pursuit. Choosing myself without apology. Starting over with nothing gave me that choice. It gave me space. And in that space, I found something I hadn't known I was missing. Not success, not recognition, not certainty. Belonging to my own life. I understood then that beginning again didn't require grand outcomes. It required presence, the willingness to stay engaged, even when nothing exciting was happening. That was the lesson hidden inside the emptiness. The days continued, quiet, unremarkable, full in a way I hadn't experienced before. I no longer counted what I lacked. I noticed what remained. Time, attention, choice. Those were enough. When I think back to the morning I had nothing left, I don't feel regret. I feel gratitude. That moment stripped my life down to its truth. And the truth was this. I started over with nothing. And for the first time, nothing was missing.